diplomatic efforts of the U.S. government with Iran would have borne fruit to avoid conflict. That has not happened. For almost 50 years, the terrorist regime in Iran waged war against the U.S., responsible for wounding and killing thousands of American service members during this time. Thoughts and prayers this morning are first and foremost with our brave military members in the Middle East who are undertaking very dangerous duty. It's my hope that their heroic efforts can bring about an end to the Iran-sponsored violence and terrorism that has plagued the region for almost a half century. One final point. Yesterday, I once again called on Senator Schumer, Senate Democrat colleagues, to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security, including our Coast Guard, FEMA, and TSA. That call is more urgent than ever now that we have the risk of Iran terrorist retaliation across the globe and here in the United States. But we're not focused on those issues, despite their importance this morning. We're focused on security here in Alaska, the Arctic. And I want to thank all of you for being here as we examine one of the most consequential national security challenges facing our country. Whether the United States is making the right infrastructure and force posture investments to secure our Arctic and North Pacific approaches in an era of great power competition. Let me set the stage. During some of our nation's most existential crises, like World War II and the Cold War, Alaska played an immensely important role in defending our country. When we won the Cold War, something dangerous began to happen. The Pentagon's understanding of the importance of Alaska began to fade. Bases closed, armories shuttered across Western Alaska. Alaska drifted from strategic cornerstone to strategic backwater in the eyes of many in the Pentagon. I saw this national security amnesia about our great state firsthand when I arrived in the Senate in 2015. The Arctic then was considered a strategic backwater. The Obama administration, when I joined the Senate in 2015, announced plans to cut 40,000 active duty Army forces, including the 5,000 strong 425 at JBER, the only airborne brigade combat team in the entire Asia Pacific. Just a few years later, the Coast Guard announced it had plans to reduce its presence and footprint in Alaska. In countless hearings and meetings and provisions in the National Defense Authorization, putting holds on the confirmation of senior military and civilian officials, and of course, engagements from so many Alaskans and communities throughout our state who knew our history and voiced strong opposition against military cuts in our state. We've changed the dynamic. We are now undergoing the largest military buildup and expansion, billions of dollars in investment in Alaska since World War II. 425 at JBER has expanded into the Army's 11th Airborne Division, now fully centered in our state. Eielson was not shuttered, but is now home to 2 squadrons of F-35s. When combined with the 2 squadrons of F-22s here at JBER, gives Alaska over 100 fifth-generation fighters. No place on the planet Earth has that kind of fifth-gen combat-coded firepower. Our role as the cornerstone of missile defense, literally protecting the whole country, is expanding significantly, particularly in the interior. The $1 billion long-range discrimination radar system finalized at CLEAR, Golden Dome initiative, which is in the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, has a down payment of $25 billion. Ted Stevens Center for the Arctic, which I was able to get into an NDAA bill a few years ago, with over 60 dedicated veterans at JBER, has rapidly become one of the world's premier national security think tanks. The infrastructure we need in Alaska to project American power is expanding. It's a $500 million investment in a brand new runway at J-Bear. $400 million to start the building of the Deepwater Strategic Port in Nome. The Working Families Tax Cuts Act, $115 million to start reopening the Navy base at Adak, one of the most strategic places in the Indo-Pacific. None of this is including the historic Coast Guard investments we are making in Alaska. But are we doing enough? That is the question this hearing will focus on today. My belief is we're doing a lot, but we need to do more. The Arctic is a strategic front line for the defense of the American homeland. Nowhere is the need for sustained investment clearer than here in Alaska, America's only Arctic state. We are seeing the importance of the Arctic play out in real time, particularly from our near-peer adversaries, China and Russia. Take a look at this chart right here. Russia continues to expand and modernize its Arctic footprint. Deep water ports, airfields, radar systems, and forward operating bases, let alone 54 icebreakers, many of which are nuclear and weaponized. China, despite having no Arctic territory, calls itself a near Arctic state and is rapidly expanding its polar capabilities. Over the past 2 years, we go to the next slide. Joint Russian and Chinese naval and air operations have occurred off Alaska's coastline with increasing frequency and sophistication. Let's take a look at this chart. By the way, we had a Russian incursion just 10 days ago, so that's a new one. But the very significant and unprecedented element of this chart are the green examples of incursions either into our water or our airspace. The green are joint Russian-Chinese strategic bomber or naval task force operations. That's not happening anywhere else in America, only in Alaska. And I'd like to submit this article for the record without objection. This is a Wall Street Journal article written on December 29th about China's push to master the Arctic Ocean, an alarming shortcut to the US. This article in part said, quote, for China, mastery of Arctic travel could yield valuable data about the natural resources awaiting below melting ice caps, significantly reducing travel time for commercial shipping and positioning nuclear-armed submarines closer to potential targets, including the US. Chinese are being more and more aggressive across the high north. US Air Force General Alexis Gwenowich, the top leader of NATO, said Chinese vessels on research missions, which we had off the coast of Alaska, literally all summer, last summer, often give cover military purposes. And that's what we know the Chinese were doing off the coast of our state this past summer. These activities are deliberate. They test our readiness, our response time, and our resolve. The question before us is simple. Posture to deter them. If not, what platforms are required? What infrastructure is required? Let me begin with the Navy. Next slide. Strategic hinge between the Arctic and Indo-Pacific runs through the Aleutian Island chain. This is a slide that depicts where our Navy has been investing. And it's significant. If you look in the central avenue of approach, billions and billions of dollars. But the northern avenue of approach, which is much quicker, where all the activity is, in terms of aircraft, in terms of shipping, in terms of undersea cables, has almost nothing in terms of infrastructure. The strategic hinge, as I mentioned in the Arctic, is the Aleutian Islands. Adak sits at that hinge. If you look on this map, again, the $115 million tag, but we were able to get the budget reconciliation bill to reopen Adak. When the Naval Air Facility at Adak was closed in the 1990s, Our assumptions about the security environment changed. The geography did not. Forward naval presence at Adak would dramatically reduce transit times into the Bering Sea and Arctic approaches, increase on-station time for surface ships, submarines, and maritime patrol craft, and strengthen anti-submarine warfare, surveillance, and rapid crisis response. As noted, we were able to get a start of $115 million, forward basing at Adak. It's not about nostalgia for an old base, it's about credible deterrence. Presence prevents crisis, absence invites testing. We are undertaking an exciting example of rebuilding a military base in our state that's going to involve the private sector, the Aleut Corporation, the state of Alaska, which has already put in $30 million to repave the runways, in all services, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, and the Army. That is happening. Senior level Pentagon officials have put forward a task force beyond just the Navy to reopen this very important base. Just as the Pentagon didn't downsize in Alaska's plan, the Coast Guard didn't either. I made sure of that by putting a hold on the confirmation of the Commandant of the Coast Guard when they had plans to reduce their presence in Alaska. And I said, Admiral, you need to provide a plan to increase your presence in Alaska, or you will not get confirmed. So he did that. We are now expanding with hundreds of millions of dollars in so many communities across our great state. Investments in Kodiak, Ketchikan, Seward, Sitka, Valdez, Petersburg. But here's the really exciting thing with regard to the Coast Guard. The Working Families Tax Cuts Act included the largest investment in the Coast Guard in American history, $25 billion. As chairman of the Coast Guard subcommittee, I was honored to write a lot of this. Here's what it entails: 16 new icebreakers, 22 new cutters, 40 new helicopters, $4.5 billion in shoreside infrastructure, $300 million for Juneau to home port the icebreaker Storis in Alaska. First icebreaker ever home ported in the state with the ice. Imagine that. This funding is a result of years of sustained advocacy across 4 administrations. But we are not done. I recently chaired a Coast Guard subcommittee hearing with the Commandant of the Coast Guard. When I asked about potential for more icebreakers being home ported in Alaska, he responded by saying that the Coast Guard is considering home porting up to 4 more icebreakers in our great state. That is exciting. And what else is exciting about the buildup of the Coast Guard in Alaska? It is spurring some of the most exciting economic activity we have seen in years. A boom in shipbuilding and heavy maintenance activity throughout our state, from Kodiak to Seward to Ketchikan. Even Wrangell is now looking at a major shipbuilding operation. This is exciting. Literally hundreds and hundreds of new paying jobs have expanded in our state, with room to grow as we get more ships from the Coast Guard and NOAA. But ships alone are not enough. Without forward logistics hubs, deep draft ports, maintenance capacity, and operational staging areas, cutters and naval vessels spend too much time transiting from the lower 48. This is where Nome comes in. Port of Nome is poised to become the United States' first deep water port in the Arctic, a critical asset for national security, Arctic logistics, and regional economic development. As sea routes become more accessible and vessel traffic through the Bering Strait increases, the absence of a deep water port north of Dutch Harbor has been a glaring strategic gap for our country and certainly for our state. Nome will serve as a forward staging hub for the Coast Guard and the Navy, strengthening maritime domain awareness and improving response times for research and rescue and environmental emergencies. Just take a look, if you can see there, on what our current NORTHCOM commander and previous NORTHCOM commander have all said about Nome and how important it is. General Guillot, our current NORTHCOM commander, said the presence is the best form of deterrence in the Arctic. Port of Nome is a game changer for operations in the Arctic. Similarly, the former NORTHCOM commander, General Van Herk, said an Arctic port north of Anchorage capable of accommodating large naval surface combatants and polar security cutters would provide significant benefits to the maritime homeland defense mission of U.S. NORTHCOM. I would reiterate the need for fuel north of Dutch Harbor, and I fully support the Army Corps of Engineers' plan to build a port at Nome. By the way, just take a look at this map. It's something else that's a little frustrating as Alaskans. You see the eastern seaboard of the United States. There are big strategic ports everywhere up and down, but not in our state. We don't have anything along the entire western part of Alaska. Well, that's going to change with the Port of Nome. And we are excited about all the work that we've done, Joy and others. We've been able to expedite the feasibility study, and we're going to start building it this summer. I also want to do a shout out to my staff, my excellent staff, or Scott Leathard. He very brilliantly got in a infrastructure bill that we got through the Senate, a cost share change just for Alaska from 65-35. Feds pay 65, the state or local communities pay 35 to 90-10 for all Alaska infrastructure projects. I got really great staff. That has saved our state and local communities literally hundreds of millions of dollars going 90-10 on infrastructure matches, which is just fantastic for Alaska. When we talk about the Arctic, we do so in terms of strategic importance, transportation routes, and the wealth of resources in this part of the world. But here's something that is often left out in the debates. The people. How investing in the Arctic could be more transformative for the brilliant people who live in the Arctic, otherwise known as Alaskans. Deepwater Port Nome will transform the area. It will support more than 50 surrounding communities, many of them Alaska Native communities facing some of the highest costs of goods in the country. It will lower the cost of goods and services, including for fuel, and provide enormous economic opportunities to the area, including good paying jobs. Arctic security requires an integrated architecture. Navy forward presence at Adak, a modernized and expanded Coast Guard icebreaker fleet, deep draft port infrastructure at Nome and other places, joint operational integration of air, sea, and surveillance assets across Alaska. The Arctic is growing in global importance, strategically, economically, and militarily. We want to deter aggression, protect American sovereignty, increase our economic opportunities, and maintain stability in the high north. Our infrastructure and force posture must reflect this operational reality. The United States is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. It's time our investments fully reflect that fact. One final point. I mentioned that the engagement of Alaskan communities is so important. We, all of us, have made huge differences. The Tiger team in Fairbanks kept Eielson open. When the 425 was threatened with closure, the colonel in charge of going around the country to hear from communities came back to me after visiting every community in America where they were looking to cut these 40,000 troops. And he just walked in my office, shaking his head, saying, "Senator, I've never seen anything like it." Everywhere I went in Alaska, giant turnout, bands, marching bands, everybody for the troops and that unit. The only place in the country he saw that. We've made a difference. That is why having an official Senate field hearing in Alaska is so important. The idea here is we are bringing the Senate to all of you, so you don't have to travel 5,000 miles to DC. And finally, it is also an opportunity to showcase our deep knowledge from our own fellow Alaskans. Brings me to the introduction of our witnesses today. 5 of the world's foremost experts on Arctic, national security, and infrastructure issues. You saw in that final slide all the different articles that are happening with regard to the Arctic. There you go. And that's just a sampling, but there's an awakening, and that's good news. But what's really good news is that in our state, we have some of the foremost knowledge on these issues. 5 of them are here today, with some in the audience, like me, Treadwell. So I want to welcome our witnesses, and let me quickly introduce each one. Ambassador Mike Shrega, Interim Chancellor of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the nation's first Ambassador at Large for Arctic Affairs. Ambassador Shrega is a 3-time presidential appointee, former chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, a Fulbright scholar, and a recognized leader in Arctic policy, security, and international affairs with nearly 4 decades of experience working on Arctic issues. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you. Next, we have Major General Randy Church-Key, U.S. Air Force retired. He is the director of the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. General Key leads the Department of Defense's newest regional center focused on Arctic security cooperation. Previously served 30 years in the Air Force, culminating his military career as a 2-star general and director of strategy, policy, planning, and capabilities at U.S. European Command. General, welcome. General Joe Ralston, U.S. Air Force retired, one of my favorite people in the whole world. Vice Chairman of the Cohen Group, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, probably the coolest title in the U.S. military, Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Commander, Commander of European Command, hundreds of combat missions in Vietnam. General Ralston brings decades of senior military leadership experience and deep expertise in transatlantic and global security matters. Next, another favorite of mine, Ms. Joy Baker, Port Director of the City of Nome, Alaska. Joy has more than 34 years of public service with the City of Nome, including serving as Harbor Master, Special Projects Master, and Port Director. She recently returned from retirement, thank you, to help lead the transformational expansion of the Port of Nome into a deep draft Arctic port for our nation's security. And finally, Captain Steve White, Coast Guard Captain Steve White, Executive Director of the Marine Exchange of Alaska. Captain White joined the Marine Exchange in 2021 after a 31-year Coast Guard career, where his final assignment was Sector Commander and Captain of the Port for Southeast Alaska. Brings extensive operational and maritime domain awareness experience across Alaska and beyond. So to our witnesses, thank you. Thank you for your decades of service. The amount of service to our country here is in the hundreds of years. And I'm very much looking forward to each of you delivering your opening statement. You will be recognized for 5 minutes, and a longer statement can appear in the record if you would like that. So why don't we begin with you, Ambassador Shrega, for your opening statement.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. Thank you for convening this important hearing. I'm Mike Sbrega. I'm the Interim Chancellor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. My central message today is Arctic infrastructure and Alaska infrastructure are national security imperatives, as you noted, Senator. And Alaska sits at this nexus of domestic and foreign policy. I think that is often overlooked and should be injected into everything we talk about in terms of Alaska and the new Arctic. National security, homeland security, economic security, energy security, mineral and resource security, and community security all rely on robust, integrated, well-resourced Arctic infrastructure. A tall order made even more complicated by the Arctic's harsh and changing landscape. Ports, maritime access, icebreakers, communication systems, logistics nodes, research platforms are not simply economic assets. They are the foundation of American presence and sovereignty. These foundational principles are described in the White House's recently published America's Maritime Action Plan. If there is a focal point for Arctic maritime infrastructure investment, I believe it's in the Bering Strait region. Consider the Port of Nome, as you have done, Senator. The Port of Nome is strategically significant because it's the closest U.S. port to highly transited Bering Strait, and it's being developed to become our nation's first deep draft American port. As we look to address the increase in Arctic shipping and increases in coordinated Russian and Chinese military operations in the region, we should reconceptualize the Port of Nome, and I believe we should be thinking about a port complex, co-locating various federal, state, and local agencies, monitoring vessels, supporting research, and enabling economic development. Aggregating such resources in one location is in our national and state interest, and just like Arctic Legos, it builds on existing infrastructure footprints to leverage missions and relationships and reduce costs while supporting advanced and expanded capabilities. Scientific research and maritime security are mutually reinforcing in the Arctic. Research improves forecasting, mapping, charting, environmental monitoring, and operational awareness, all essential for safe and effective maritime operations. A deeper understanding of the evolving maritime domain strengthens the Coast Guard's ability to operate effectively and safely. Simply put, Arctic research is a foundational pillar of Arctic security. Security in the Arctic begins with presence. Presence requires access. Access requires infrastructure. Let me leave with 8 recommendations quickly. Number 1, I think we should adopt an integrated Arctic infrastructure strategy. Ensure federal investments in ports, icebreakers, communications, and logistics are coordinated across agencies and designed for multi-mission use. 2, prioritize the Bering Strait region. Advance infrastructure development, particularly in Nome, as a strategically integrated maritime hub. I'd like us to reconceptualize the area of the Bering Strait and think about it as the Bering Strait's security, economic, and research corridor, and the Nome port as the Nome port complex. 3, revitalize Adak Naval Air Station. Strategically located on the Aleutian Islands, as you have indicated, Adak affords the United States an unparalleled air and maritime base from which we can monitor the region, project power, complement existing ports in Alaska, and further build on the long-needed string of ports in America's North. Number 4, plan now for long lead time maritime assets. Begin deliberate planning for future icebreaking and shoreside capacity to avoid capability gaps later in this decade. Number 5, embed research and domain awareness in infrastructure design. Ensure research capability, charting, communications, and monitoring systems are incorporated into maritime infrastructure planning. 6, sustain whole-of-government coordination. Empower coordinating bodies to ensure Arctic investments are complementary, fiscally responsible, and strategically coherent. Number 7, establish the sequenced Arctic infrastructure roadmap. Align port development, icebreaker recapitalization, communications upgrades, and logistics capabilities and capacities within a unified, multi-year strategy. And finally, number 8, review, and just review, the overlapping yet complementary combatant command structures and mission sets like U.S. NORTHCOM NORAD and U.S. Coast Guard Arctic District, and just consider a joint command structure between U.S. NORTHCOM and the U.S. Coast Guard, where the Arctic District maintains responsibility for shoreside activities and duties, yet activities and duties that extend beyond that area at a distance to be determined are coordinated between U.S. NORTHCOM and the Arctic District because of the activities, Senator, you have pointed out. So in conclusion, the political, physical, economic, social, cultural, and security landscapes of the Arctic are rapidly changing. The question is not whether the Arctic will matter to the United States in the near or the long term. It already does. The question before us is whether and how we will make deliberate, strategic, systematic, and sustained investments in Arctic research and infrastructure at the scale necessary to preserve American leadership and presence in the region. Through integrated Arctic infrastructure investments, the United States can ensure a region that is secure, resilient, prosperous, and governed by stability rather than uncertainty. Infrastructure in the Arctic is not merely concrete and steel. It's access, it is presence, it is resilience, it is national security. I thank you very much for this opportunity to testify, Senator.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's excellent. And the good news is we're starting to tick off some of those 8 recommendations, but we got a lot more work to do. General Key, sir, floor is yours.
Chairman Sullivan and distinguished panelists, in particular, Ambassador Shrega, General Walston, Joy, and Steve, thank you for the privilege and opportunity to offer remarks today. It is important to recognize the vital necessity to align U.S. maritime infrastructure investments with national security needs. These reflections for me, of course, are based on years of experience since Arctic security and defense, and not necessarily representative of within the Pentagon or the Department of War. However, the recently released National Defense Strategy provides the language and suitable framework to address the principal focal points of the priority needs and are directly applicable to this hearing. They are 1, defend the U.S. homeland; 2, deter China in the Indo-Pacific through strength, not confrontation; 3, increase burden sharing with U.S. allies and partners; and 4, supercharge the U.S. defense industrial base. These are directly tieable to Alaska. The NDS clearly states American interests are under threat throughout the Western Hemisphere, including North American Arctic. Homeland Defense is the Department's stated top priority, and deterring China from a position of strength starts at the first island chain, but deterrence should extend across the depth and breadth of the Pacific. Here's where the geography and key terrain in Alaska is inferred in the NDS. Alaska is the top of the Indo-Pacific, the northwest corner of the American homeland, and deeply connected to the Arctic. As a 30-year plus veteran of U.S. Air Force service, I'm reminded daily of the wisdom of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who in essence highlighted Alaska as the most strategic key terrain for the ages. Further, the recently released White House Maritime Action Plan provides a number of policy and programmatic recommendations to revitalize America's lagging capacities in shipbuilding workforce, protecting the maritime industrial base, and connecting national security interests to economic security and industrial resilience for maritime communities. These are somewhat connected to your reflections there, Ambassador Shrega. The specific aspects of the Maritime Action Plan rightly key on needed policy actions and programmatically directly related to the topics of this hearing. I can certainly elaborate on these in the Q&A, sir. Sea lines of communication in the U.S. and Pan-Arctic region are emerging as strategic arteries of national power, economic stability, and military mobility. Ensuring freedom of navigation, domain awareness, and credible presence along these routes is central to maintain strategic stability and securing U.S. national interests in the high latitudes. Infrastructure development and logistical support will determine whether the United States can effectively operate, protect maritime interests, deter adversaries, and uphold sovereignty in this critical region. From a strategic economic vantage, it is soon to be that Bering Straits are going to be as important as the Straits of Malacca. Securing many of America's national interests in the Arctic is increasingly defined by the need for ready Coast Guard and Department of War forces, as well as appropriate infrastructure. Competitors and adversaries have invested in ice-capable fleets, port infrastructure, logistic networks, surveillance systems designed to establish enduring operational reach and create security advantages aligned to their interests. We should carefully consider their example. The United States currently faces infrastructure challenges that constrain operational flexibility. Limited deep water port capacity in Alaska, sparse logistics staging nodes, communication, positioning, navigation, and timing vulnerabilities, and insufficient domain awareness infrastructure reduce America's ability to protect U.S. security interests, defend the homeland, and surge capability to and through the Arctic. In a region where distance, extreme climatic conditions, and logistics define operational success, infrastructure is strategically vital. In the Arctic, groundwork has been for future advantages not laid in battlefields, but in ports, airfields, shipping lanes, comms cables, satellite coverage, and industrial capacity. For the United States, this means investment in maritime infrastructure to expeditionary forward basing as active instruments of deterrence and in some resource and the needs outlined in the White House Maritime Action Plan. Failing to build these for the presence and resilience during peacetime sees initiative and competition, when outcomes can still be influenced at far lower costs and risk than during crisis, where historically winning demands brute force investment regardless of the price tag. Infrastructure, sir, is the operational enabler and is required for mission success. Effective maritime operations depend on four foundational infrastructure pillars: access, sustainment, awareness, and connectivity. This too we can build out during the Q&A. Alaska is America's Arctic. Investments made here serve not only local communities, but national defense, readiness, and allied cooperation. We are NATO's northwest flank. Infrastructure in Alaska enables homeland defense, the nation's northern approaches, while supporting safe economic activity and emergency response. Community safety and national security are actually mutually reinforcing. The Arctic is a strategic maritime center of gravity. Infrastructure is the enabling foundation for security, defense, safety, and cooperation. Without deliberate, sustained investment, the United States risks operational disadvantage in a region essential to homeland defense and maritime leadership. As the United States pursues a strategy of peace through strength as an enduring condition of prosperity, in the U.S. Arctic, such a strategy can be achieved through a well-prepared and equipped joint force with the infrastructure that enables that joint force to deter and dissuade America's adversaries, and if deterrence fails, providing the means to defeat such adversaries with minimum risk. Sir, thank you for the opportunity to present this. I look forward to further Q&A. It's a privilege to be a part of this conversation.
Great, thank you, General. General Ralston.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan, and thank you for the opportunity. I think you can hear it.
I think the mic is good for the cameras. You might want to use that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll start again. Chairman Sullivan, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. I'll make a brief statement and submit the remainder of my remarks for the record.
Without objection.
I've lived in Anchorage for over 20 years, and I had the privilege of serving as commander of Alaskan Command in 1992, 93, and 94. The Arctic is evolving into a highly contested front in our strategic competition with both China and Russia. I want to commend you, Senator, for your continued leadership in drawing attention to this region's significance, both through holding this hearing and for your efforts every day in Congress. Given the growing importance of the Arctic to our national security, the U.S. must invest in infrastructure that supports a credible U.S. presence and strategic deterrence in the Arctic. In my opinion, this requires reopening Naval Air Facility Adak and establishing a deepwater port in Nome. When I was stationed in Alaska, I saw firsthand the importance of a robust U.S. presence in the high north. Adak was a crucial operational hub for U.S. forces and a vital forward location for logistics, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The 1995 BRAC decision to decommission Adak was part of the post-Cold War realignment and was based on the security reality of that era. However, 3 decades later, strategic realities in the Arctic have shifted considerably. While the number of incidents fluctuates, as you pointed out, the trend is that our principal adversaries increasingly and more aggressively seek to test America's strategic resolve in the region. The growing threat posed by China and Russia in the Arctic demands persistent monitoring and a force posture capable of rapid response. Adak would strengthen the deterrence by denial. As the westernmost municipality in the U.S., and Senator, I know you know this, but unfortunately, I think many of your colleagues in Washington don't. Adak is 1,100 nautical miles closer to the Taiwan Strait than any of our bases in Hawaii. Accordingly, Adak would also bolster U.S. operational readiness and enhance our military's ability to rapidly deploy forces to respond to any potential conflict in the Pacific. With regard to the Port of Nome, as the American shipping industry is positioned to soon take advantage of new Arctic shipping routes, the Port of Nome can serve as a strategic gateway to the Arctic. However, we cannot properly patrol these areas and protect U.S. commercial interests if our icebreakers are home ported thousands of miles away. For example, in August of 2025, several Chinese research vessels were operating north of Utqiagvik. Fortunately, the U.S. icebreaking cutter Healy was nearby and could quickly dispatch to observe the research vessels. If the Healy, home ported in Seattle, was at home port, it would have taken up to 2 weeks to get to Arctic waters. The Coast Guard has made significant investments to expand the U.S. fleet of Arctic security cutters, Developing the Port of Nome is a critical opportunity to homeport new icebreakers to ensure our access to the Arctic as demanded by the new National Defense Strategy. In conclusion, Adak and the Port of Nome are not niche remote facilities. They are strategic fulcrums that sit at the intersection of the Arctic, North Pacific, and Indo-Pacific operating areas. Arctic security cannot be effectively managed from outside of the region. A permanent presence is required to ensure we have military capability where we need it, when we need it. It would also extend homeland defenses to the Arctic and to the residents of Alaska, who are increasingly concerned by the unprecedented intrusions of our adversaries in their backyard. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, General. Thank you for your service. I would add, you mentioned a lot of my colleagues don't know it's 1,100 miles closer in terms of Adak from Hawaii. I would say a lot of admirals and generals don't know that either, which is part of our oversight role, as you know, in the Senate. Next, we have Ms. Baker. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity to testify today on behalf of the City of Nome. My name is Joy Baker, and I serve as a Port Director and Project Manager for the Arctic Deep Draft Port at Nome. I will be talking today about the importance of the project for Alaska and the nation. This is an exciting time for the project, and honestly, Senator, without your leadership, we would not be where we are today. Before I focus on the importance of the Arctic Deep Draft Port, I would like to quickly put the strategic nature of Nome's location into perspective. Everyone in this room is familiar with General Billy Mitchell's 1935 statement to Congress. I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. I think it is the most important strategic place in the world. His prediction was validated during World War II when Alaska and Nome played a critical logistical role to support the Lend-Lease program and the delivery of military aircraft to the Soviet Union. More than 8,000 aircraft were delivered via the Alaska-Siberia route. Alaska's locational importance continued into the Cold War, and when you visit Nome, you can still see the White Alice up on the summit of Anvil Mountain. Today, Nome is proving once again to be vital for U.S. national security. The Arctic Deep Draft Port project in Nome is designed to serve as the critical refueling and resupply facility in the U.S. Arctic for U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessels. Without this vital maritime infrastructure, U.S. national security operations in the Arctic will be constrained, and the U.S. will fall further behind Russia and China, who are operating in the region with increasing persistence. As China and Russia continue to escalate activities in the Arctic, the U.S. must have a physical shoreside presence to protect the nation's northwest flank. The solution is the construction of America's deep draft port. Since 2011, the Alaska Congressional Delegation, the State of Alaska Legislature, the City of Nome, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have collaborated toward achieving development of the nation's first Arctic deep draft port. There have been a few bumps along the road, but we are finally moving forward into construction this year. Mr. Chairman, one of the key milestones in this process was the meeting you convened in D.C. 3 years ago. After hearing that interagency miscommunication could jeopardize the basic functionality of the project, you brought together Army Corps leadership, Navy and Coast Guard technical representatives, and the City of Nome to make sure the design of the project would support national security missions. The focus of that meeting was to get the depth right, minus 40 feet. We did that. With a basin large enough to accommodate heavy polar security cutters, Navy destroyers and cruisers, national security cutters, and fuel tankers. We walked out of that meeting in agreement on those criteria, and the final design of the project reflects the priorities to support these national security vessels. Now it's time to make good on these commitments and deliver the Arctic maritime infrastructure necessary to support vessel operations in the region. Mr. Chairman, here are my recommendations for the next steps needed to advance U.S. maritime national security interests in the Arctic. Ensure the full construction of the Arctic Deep Draft Port as originally designed by the Corps and authorized by Congress. begin seasonal Coast Guard operations in Nome to establish a U.S. national security presence in the Bering Strait region, develop shoreside infrastructure and capabilities to support the national security vessel operations, and home port a new heavy and medium class icebreaker in Nome. These steps will send a much needed strong message to Russia and China that the U.S. is protecting its interests in the Arctic region, and Nome is ready to provide these ships with a place to refuel, reprovision, and help protect our nation's interest. In conclusion, U.S. national security vessel operations must be supported through strategically placed coastal marine infrastructure adjacent to the Arctic. We need your continued leadership and the steadfast support of the Alaska delegation to see this project through to completion. Construction of Nome's Arctic Deep Draft Port will strengthen U.S. national security interests throughout the Arctic. I stand by to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Baker. Captain White, you're batting cleanup, but that doesn't mean you're not very important.
Ahoy, Senator. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, I could probably throw away all these prepared remarks because I think they all just got said by the group. So I'm going to go off script a little bit at great risk. Yeah, I got about 40 years of experience in the maritime. So I'm going to shift my comments a little bit to talking about what's happening on the water and maybe why these groups and these SAGs and all this traffic is here. And it was mentioned all the resources and how rich Alaska is, and the fishing, the mining, the oil, the natural resources. That's why these other folks are coming up here. It's also why it's a transit zone. Our maritime borders here, that route you talked about, you called it the northern route, the Great Circle traffic route. It's a shorter route from Asia to our western ports. It's full. If we were to look at a picture right now, there's all kinds of ships that are going on that we just don't think about on a day-to-day. Alaska is strategically close to some of these actors that are coming through here, that Bering Straits waterway. And Sky, if you go just advance a couple slides, I just want to, this waterway right here is a choke point. And when things are going on like they are in Iran, where we have some shipping choke points that affect the world's really economy, this is one of the few choke points in the world that's going to become more significant. It's not just about water opening up with ice, but the traffic that is coming through this Bering Strait is going to increase. You can look at the all the routes that come through the Arctic, and they all come by this route right here in Nome. So it's critically important to Russia. 20% of their GDP is coming through the Bering Straits and right through our waters. Our traffic on the U.S. side, it's to support what we have going on in the U.S. Research, some tourism, fisheries, supporting the communities up there, and of course, the military and the Coast Guard that operates there. So we need to have investments. I guess I'm foot stomping on that, not just in the Coast Guard, and it's beyond icebreakers. All these needs with all this traffic and all these ports to serve as governance for the fisheries, for research, for protection of our mariners that are out there is important. And I believe that we're not just bringing icebreakers closer to ice, we're bringing patrol cutters closer to the fight for all these other reasons too. So thank you for your investments in that. The other thing, I can't emphasize enough these ports and having the right logistics to support the maritime community. I pulled in Adak when I was an ensign. There were swimming pools, McDonald's, fuel, groceries, everything you needed to patrol these waters on the edge of our thing. And it's just sad. I patrolled in there. I did 7 tours in Alaska. I did finish up here. I started there. And when I pulled in last time, we had more people on the ship than we did living in the town. And it was a lot harder to get the Schlitz we needed to keep doing the job. So having some logistics ports where we can do the missions that we need to protect the Arctic is very important. And I'm going to finish with this. The answer is collaboration. Mr. Strega mentioned it, working with research, collaboration between the military and the Coast Guard with the locals, because the people up here in Alaska they are the greatest resource. Forget all the oil and the money and the fisheries and all that. Living in 7 different places, being stationed in 7 different places in Alaska. In fact, I married a commercial fisherman. She helped steal my heart towards this, but I met the fabric of Alaska and the spirit of Alaska that makes it work up here. And that collaboration with people who have the knowledge and the buy-in, who understand how important it is, needs to happen. The military brings a lot of Schlitz, but they change out people a lot. They need to collaborate better with the people who actually live here and have the buy-in to be more effective. That includes the Coast Guard. And I believe this full-heartedly, that public-private partnerships, we can do things faster. We can we can address these capability gaps by working together. So working with academia and funding to get that knowledge, but it's got to lead to what everybody mentioned here, closing the capabilities gap. We don't just need to do research. We need to do research that builds capacity. Putting in more military up here, more Coast Guard up here, communications infrastructure to close the capacity gap. If we're going to govern the Arctic, we're behind. We see what the adversaries have done. They've built out the ports. They've built out the capabilities. We need to get on it here. And thank you for all your work, because I know work to help with the communications equipment up here, help with research. I also chair the AOS board. I know you were instrumental in getting more funding for the research community up here during a hard time, and all the work you've done with the military and the Coast Guard. I'll close by saying that. And I don't think I went over. I'm looking at my old boss, Admiral Bell, see if he's giving me a glaring eye yet. But yeah, these public-private partnerships and the investment into the military, the Coast Guard, and programs that leverage local knowledge and buy-in should be considered as a quick, expedited way to help close some of these infrastructure and communication gaps that have been mentioned by everybody here.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Captain White. I want to thank all our witnesses. By the way, I also want to thank UAA. This probably is one of the first Senate hearings where there's a significant swag for everybody to see. Water, great looking UAA ties. I'm not even sure what this is. Coffee beans. Okay, coffee beans. So I want to thank the university in all seriousness. Well, look, I think this is a demonstration. These are our local witnesses who I think demonstrate that they're some of the most knowledgeable people in the whole country, maybe even the whole world, on these important Arctic issues. So let me begin, and I'll start with some of our, I can open up these questions to really all the witnesses, but you saw the chart that my team and I keep a very close tabs on, and that's just the increasing, the next slide, if you go to that, the increasing number of incursions. And the really unprecedented element here is the joint operations between Russia and China. That's not happened. So why don't I start with you, General Key? Can you talk about, is this pattern from your perspective represent a temporary signaling effort, or are we witnessing the normalization of sustained great power competition here in the Arctic? I think it's clearly the latter, but you're again at the forefront of the Pentagon's most important think tank on the Arctic. What does this signify to you, including, and I don't even think we have it listed, the Chinese up in the Arctic all summer. Let's face it, they weren't doing research to save the whales, right? They were spying on us. We know that. And the green slides, which I think are really, really important and very unprecedented.
In briefest answer, Senator, you're right. The latter is correct. I'll build that out. Over the past several.
Latter meaning we should anticipate this being the new
This is the
normal.
new normal. This is not the preceding. This is the new normal. This pattern is a normalization of sustained great power competition in the Arctic between Beijing and Moscow against the United States and the West. Over the past several years, joint activity between Russia and China in the vicinity of Alaska, including coordinated bomber patrols entering the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ for folks in the audience, and their combined naval task groups transiting near the Aleutians has shifted from sporadic demonstrations to increasingly routine operations. What was once episodic signaling tied to specific geopolitical moments now reflects recurring seasonal patterns of presence. And that distinction, ladies and gentlemen, and Senator and distinguished colleagues, truly matters. Classic signaling is typically reactive and bounded. For example, a response to an exercise, a sanction, or a crisis somewhere else, putting pressure in this region as a result. Instead, what we are seeing here is a sustained operational repetition. Repetition builds familiarity, improves interoperability, and normalizes presence. In sum, this is a shaping operation from my vantage point.
Can I ask, just to
Please.
interrupt here, but when, and maybe General Ralston, you can jump in here too, when countries do joint ops, and they're launching, if you go back one slide here, there you go, the Anadir, you see that in Russia. So that's an Air Force base right there under the adversaries in America's Arctic. That's where they're launching the strategic bomber operation. So the Chinese are using that Russian air base as a very close jumping off point. You see how close that is to Alaska. But General Ralston, how, these, you can't just throw together a joint strategic bomber task force with Russian and Chinese strategic bombers and fighters, or I think even more complex. 2 summers ago, they had a 12-ship strategic naval task force. And then the prior summer before that, it was a 7-ship strategic naval task force. You're an Air Force expert, but you are also a combatant commander. So you understand Navy ops and Air Force ops. How hard is that? How much planning does that take? And again, at the strategic level, those strategic ops probably have to get sign off from Putin and Xi Jinping. Would you agree with that? Can you just talk a little bit in your experience, again, going back to the green indicators there on this slide? Those aren't easy to put together, and they are very unprecedented. They're not doing that on the East Coast. They're not doing that pretty much anywhere else, certainly in America, but around the world. How important is that, and how should we take note of that?
Senator, it's a very good question. And let me say up front, this is not something that you just put together casually.
Right.
To give you an example, in 1993, I led the first U.S. exercise for Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. We took the 210th Air Rescue Squadron here from Anchorage, a bunch of troops, 2 C-5s, helicopters, and we deployed to Russia to do a joint exercise with the Russians. That took months of coordination to do that. And it also took approval from the highest levels of the United States government and the highest levels of the Russian government.
So you think that's the same here? Xi Jinping and Putin are signing off on these ops?
There's no question they do that.
Yeah.
And the other thing, why are they doing that? Well, they both have got interest in the Arctic. The shipping routes, potential shipping routes in the future, they're both very interested in that. So yes, there's interest, and it does take strategic cooperation at the highest levels to put exercises like that together.
Great. Let me go to the next kind of element of the focus of this hearing. And it's, if we're responding to this, which we must, in my view, and I think most Alaskans, most Americans would agree to, there's kind of two different ways to think about it from a military perspective that relates to forward infrastructure. And that is, during the Cold War, we maintained forward infrastructure in places like Adak or Galena or other places in our state. And from a deterrence standpoint, how different is it to surge to respond model, which is kind of what we're doing now? You can go back one slide there. So you look at where we're launching our Air Force assets, Eielson, J-Bear primarily, and you look at the numbers we have on that chart, it's almost 1,000 miles to get to our ADIS, which is where we want to meet the Russians. They're not going 1,000 miles launching from Anadyr. So that takes tanking missions, that takes all kinds of sophisticated logistical operations. But previously, our persistent presence forward with regard to infrastructure was in some ways deterrent. So right now, I would call this kind of a surge to respond model, launching 1,000 miles just to meet these guys. Same with our Navy. Heck, they're launching from San Diego. That's like 4,000 miles. But how much more deterrence capability does it give us if we have the forward infrastructure at Nome, at Adak, but in other places? You know, I mentioned the a new runway at J-Bear. A lot of people aren't tracking that. That's gonna, I've talked to senior Air Force officials. They say that's gonna make J-Bear probably the most strategic Air Force base on the planet. Certainly in the Indo-PACOM by having two major massive runway capabilities. But for everybody here, because this is a question that's kind of at the heart of the hearing, the infrastructure forward helps us in different ways. Ambassador, you want to take a first crack at that, and then I'll open that up to everybody. And are we missing infrastructure opportunities? I've always talked about, you know, the west coast of Alaska as needing a series of ports, not just Nome, but other places as well. There's other communities that are looking this Point Clarence, Port Clarence, Point out at Kotzebue, Cape Blossom. There's a whole host of other areas. So can you all talk about that?
Senator, thank you. With your permission, Scott, can you bring up, I have a couple of slides. You and I used these slides at the Munich Security Conference just a couple of years ago. Let's see, yeah, the Pacific slide is a good one. Maybe back one to the North American. So this is how I view the Arctic, but also, Senator, I think it's to your point, and to General, your point about being a fulcrum, the state being a fulcrum. And I see that, and to General Key's comment about the western flank of NATO. So if you look at this graphic, I think about forward basing and not just surging for NATO, for the North American Arctic, to counter the Russian arc, that Russian influence. I see that, and actually North Korea as well. I think we need to consider their motives and their capabilities, which are just growing each and every day. Scott, the next slide, please. But on the Pacific side, this is how I see it. And although it's not an arc, it looks more like a teardrop. It kind of gets the point across, I think, where if you actually put base out at Adak, if you build Nome, if you think about a port in Port Clarence or Cape Blossom, and then you think about Indo-PACOM's capacity, I'm trying to link the two. What's NORTHCOM doing? What's Indo-PACOM doing? What's our Coast Guard doing? How do we nest those together, not just to surge, but to actually have the presence there, link it with Guam and Hawaii, so that, as I said before, we have an integrated approach to the Arctic, because this is a Pacific arc. I think that's how the Chinese see it. I think that's how they see the Straits of Malacca. I think that's how they see the South China Sea. I think that's how they see themselves in the Arctic. They don't see themselves, I think, in sort of silos. They see themselves as a global power, They want to be that blue ocean Navy, and we need to counter that by having presence and also working with our friends in Japan and Korea so that we have a robust integration of our capabilities with our allies. But nothing takes the place of having in-place capacity, because our adversaries know that in place means a whole lot more to them and to us than it does to surge. They have a lot more time, and then we become reactive. We do not want to be reactive.
Yeah.
We want to influence the theater. We don't want to be reactive to the theater.
Right. Any other thoughts on that for all of our witnesses?
I have a few reflections, and I'll give the floor to General Ralston. Number one, distances. Adak to Seoul is 2,500 miles. Anchorage to Seoul is 3,800 miles. Honolulu to Seoul is 4,600 miles.
By
Distance.
the way, there's like, I've done this like little tests with our, flag officers in the Pentagon, like including 4-star admirals and generals. I think probably well over half fail that test. They just don't know. They don't know those numbers. It's really shocking to me how few very senior military members do not know those numbers at all. They see, I'll give you my sense of it. You go to Indo-PACOM. My last billet in the Marine Corps was out at Indo-PACOM. Every senior leader in Indo-PACOM has a map, a giant map on his or her wall. And in the middle of it is Hawaii, because that's where Indo-PACOM is. And then Alaska is not even on the map. It's just the tiny end of the Aleutian Island chain in the corner of the map. And yet the Indo-PACOM commander's forces, which he owns in Alaska, 105th generation fighters, the 11th Airborne Division, all those forces are closer to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan than Hawaii. But they're looking at Hawaii as the center of the universe, literally on everyone's map. And they don't even, we're not even on their map. And it's just kind of shocking because they have no idea that the forces the Indo-PACOM commander owns and controls are much closer to what would be the contingencies if they had to use them. And so it's a frustration. It's a huge blind spot for our military.
They need to be all taught great circle routes matter.
Exactly.
And the earth is fatter in the middle than it is the top. I'll explain that more later if you'd like, sir.
You're the one guy who can do that for the Pentagon more than anybody, because remember the Ted Stevens Center is still part of the Department of War. So you're in there educating these
Which is
admirals. I think it's very important.
it's a principal point. We have 3,000 graduates of our programs now trying to make U.S. and allied security practitioners smarter about this region.
Right.
Sentinels and pickets. So we need our coastal regions to have the understanding of what's out there. And we need to have pickets, in other words, to be able to demonstrate deterrence to our adversaries that this will defend. When we look at that, what does it actually mean? It means looking at a port complex and not just connecting via air and sea. We need to think about how you connect surface routes from the rail belt to places like Nome and perhaps the Port Clarence and Nome port complex. It's taking the idea that Adak as a main operating base, for example, but then look at fixed operating sites, places that we used to have during the Cold War, like Attu, like King Salmon. So if you look at this aspect of what other areas that would, if we were periodically there, would demonstrate deterrence that this too will defend. Last piece to not offer is that when we look at the need for such investments, we need to make it Arctic ready. Before going to the Air Force in 1985, I worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Alaska District on Adak and Attu as operation places during the Cold War. We were trying to get a lot of renovation done quickly in the latter part of the 1980s, and we didn't necessarily make it Arctic proof or Arctic ready. So if you look at Adak today, you have kind of a mess out there that kind of needs to be picked up and swept up and rebuilt, be built this time Arctic ready, because the infrastructure put during that renovation period was not suited for the conditions where they're building. Respectfully submitted.
General, Joy, any other thoughts?
Let me just add a couple of points. I won't talk about the Indo-Pacific, but one of the things that people sometimes forget, our F-35s at Eielson are closer to Europe than the same airplanes on the East Coast of the United States. Our F-22s at J-Bear can be in Europe before the F-22s out of Langley Air Force Base at Virginia. So it is, again, something that FedEx and UPS figured out a long time ago, and that's why they've got major hubs here in Anchorage. They can be anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere in 8 hours. And so that's an important piece of our infrastructure. One other point, one of the hats that the Alaskan Command commander has is the commander of the Alaska NORAD region, which is responsible for intercepting the airplanes that come into our ADIZ. That's an enormously complex operation with the infrastructure we got today. The first thing you got to do is launch AWACS, and then you have to launch tankers out of Eielson, and then you launch fighters out of either Eielson or J-Bear. But it takes several hours to get to the places that we need to be to intercept those airplanes. So the infrastructure is critically important.
Joy, do you have a view on that? Okay. Let me ask, I want to go back to a slide that I had brought up. It was the one of the bases across the, that one. So again, I'd like just to comment on that. We've talked about the northern route, but here's the challenge. This is what the Pentagon, it's kind of a hard slide to read, but the Pentagon is doing a bunch of very significant infrastructure in that central route. Again, some of that makes sense, but some of that, in my view, is way overbuilt. If you look at Guam, which there's no that's very strategic, but right now they're talking about $50 billion of infrastructure investment in Guam. I've called that what I think is one of the Pentagon's biggest strategic mistakes, to concentrate so much money and firepower in assets on one small island. So again, I want to just ask, in terms of diversification of our forces and our force posture, particularly more along the northern route, which, by the way, historically, I was reminded, somebody recently mentioned this to me. If you actually look at the route that the Japanese Naval Task Force took to invade Midway and Pearl Harbor, they went up north, kind of near us, and then they came down towards those islands. So, so what I've been trying to do with the senior leadership is say you need to diversify your infrastructure, force posture in Indo-PACOM, again, towards the northern route, but also away from such a heavy concentration on Guam. Does anyone have a view on that? General Keith, you have a view on that?
I do, sir, and then yield the floor quickly. Years ago, I was the colonel in Joint Staff and at the as a staffing pogue working global defense posture. At the end of the table was Senator Stevens and Senator Inouye. And we're at the time working the discussions about how to reduce the pressure in Okinawa by putting more infrastructure in Guam to reduce essentially the geopolitical pressure the United States was feeling at the time with Japan. Years later, I was responsible as the vice commander of the 618th Tanker Lift Control Center at Scott Air Force Base of conducting the surge to Afghanistan. And so there was an evil volcano in Iceland that blew up during this time that was closing down air routes across the Atlantic to Europe and onwards to Afghanistan. We went as far north as we could. We went as far south as we could. We couldn't get assets to Afghanistan that way. So one night in a fit of frustration, I said, to hell with it. We're going west. And we're going to move the bulk of the force through on C-17s via the Great Circle route to the north, and then take the C-5s and do the central route. We were so much faster moving from the north than through the fat part of the central that we closed the central portion, the northern portions far in advance. I finally just took assets out of the central portion and rerouted them north in order to close this faster. The central piece is too fat. You can't move forces. It requires so much more fuel and time that you don't have when the crisis is there. Moving north is far faster and far more efficient from my vantage point.
Great. Other thoughts on that, General?
Just one quick thought. Guam is very vulnerable to the ballistic missile threat out of China.
Yeah.
And so you can't afford to put all of your assets in one
Yes.
place there. That's
Yes.
why you need to have a diversified infrastructure.
Yeah, my concern, if there was ever a conflict with China, and I hope there won't be, but the Guam's runway, the Anderson Air Force Base there, that might be cratered within minutes. And we have a lot of assets and we're still concentrating forces there. It just seems to be a big strategic mistake. Let's go back. Let's go to a topic that I think everybody cares about, which is icebreakers as strategic enablers. And once again, we're finally making progress on both building icebreakers and home porting them here in Alaska. It is kind of remarkable when you think about it that we've kind of gone through the history of the United States without having icebreakers home ported here. So some of you were at the home porting ceremony for the Coast Guard icebreaker, the Storis, this August in Juneau. That is going to be home ported in Juneau. We have a $300 million in the budget reconciliation bill, the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, to home port that icebreaker in Juneau. There's a number of icebreakers that are going to be built out as part of that bill, as I mentioned, 16 right now. In the hearing I had recently with the Commandant of the Coast Guard, he talked about up to four more. We'll see. I think that would be great, but even if it's not four, it still would be very significant. So can I ask all of you, in terms of, icebreakers certainly don't just do research. They enable military mobility. They enable commercial escorts. They enable freedom of navigation in ice-covered waters. Russia clearly understands this and has invested accordingly. We have a gigantic, what I have termed the icebreaker gap. Russia has, as I mentioned, 54 icebreakers, many of which are nuclear powered. They can run, kind of continuously. They're weaponized. We're finally playing catch up. But what strategic risk do we incur if we continue to operate with such a small ice-breaking fleet? But more importantly, for the purposes of this hearing, our friends in the Coast Guard, what message would you say to them as they're looking at and studying right now where to put some of these new icebreakers? I think it's very exciting that the Commandant said they're looking at up to four more in Alaska. I'd love all four. But where would you look at home porting those, and how important is that? Ms. Baker, I have a feeling I'm going to know what your answer is, since you've already testified to it. But this is important, right? This is a hearing. The subcommittee in charge of the Coast Guard, and even though we don't have any active duty Coast Guards, we got Captain White here, but as they're looking at this, the Coast Guard is actively looking at this right now, what to do, where to put them. In the Trump administration, with Finland, with Canada, this ice pack is really moving out to build icebreakers, first in Finland, then in the United States. But give me your thoughts on that. I'm assuming everybody here would welcome four more, but also the strategic importance and then where to put them.
Let me jump in, and if you permit me, let me tell you a little story that I think is embarrassing to the United States of America. And my good friend Pete Lethard, I think we're the oldest two guys in the room here, we remember this from 1988. In 1988, there was an event that happened north of then Barrow, Alaska, that got worldwide attention. There were 3 whales that got trapped in the ice up north of Barrow. And everybody from the White House around the world was focused on how in the hell are we going to save these 3 whales? And this is the heart of the Cold War, 1988. The United States of America had to go to the Soviet Union and beg for an icebreaker to come in and rescue the whales north of Barrow. So that's something that I think was an embarrassment of the United States, but it also points out that we need those icebreakers further north than where they are now, further north than Seattle and further north than Juneau.
Yeah.
And that's why I support Nome, but wherever else we can get them to the north.
Good. Other thoughts? Ms. Baker, you want to, for the record?
For the record, Senator, yes. Nome has obviously been pushing for quite some time to home port an icebreaker or other forward operating maritime Coast Guard assets. We've been working on the shoreside development to help them with seasonal activity of office, crew quarters, storage space, something to work as a foundation to build upon the development of a complex that would support a full-time home ported vessel. And we would be thrilled if we will take any of the Coast Guard vessels to be full-time home ported, and we would bring out the marching bands for the actual icebreaker. We would, yeah, we could definitely make that happen. And as we've all stated here today, I think it's a crucial and essential component of building out capacity in the Arctic by bringing the Coast Guard assets to the Arctic so that they can work more closely and be refueled, resupplied, and supported for all of their missions. For a very long time now, all of our large, whether it be commercial or military fleets, having to go to Dutch Harbor to refuel has been a problem.
Yeah.
And it continues to be, and will continue to be until the 40-foot protected deepwater basin is built and we're able to supply those vessels with everything they need to serve their missions without having the distance and travel.
Good. So look, I actually do think that whether there's going to be an icebreaker home ported in Nome, but I think clearly with the Deepwater Strategic Port, that's going to be able to utilize the Coast Guard icebreakers. But to your point, when we had that final kind of meeting with all the services, the idea, the planning, the design for the strategic port in Nome is to be able to handle essentially every ship in the Coast Guard and Navy inventory, with the exception of a U.S. aircraft carrier at Nome. And so I think you're going to be able to see, if it's not home ported, deployments there that we can use Nome as a jumping off point for not just icebreakers, but as we talked about, national security cutters, destroyers, frigates, all kinds of military hardware that has not had anywhere to go on the west coast of Alaska. Captain White, do you have a view? You're based in Juneau, so you have the first icebreaker that's coming. That was the Coast Guard's decision, you know, when they were looking at, and now they're looking at, you know, other areas in Alaska that could be the potential for home porting. Any thoughts on that from your perspective?
I think when you, hello, I think when you talk about, if you go to your northern route slide, Senator, I think you should adjust this a little, with all due respect. The one with the northern route and the one crossing the central, Scott, I think you need to move that line. Yeah, you had it. That one, the one you had right before that. Yep. Yep. I think you need to move that northern route to end in the United States a little more north. That's a much shorter route to get into the fight. And when I talk about the fight, and you talk about Coast Guard cutters in particular, keep hearing ice breaking when we talk about it, but really governance, again, enforcement, border protection, fisheries, service to all that maritime traffic that's out there and increasing in Alaska waters. By moving that northern route and having it end not on the west coast of the United States, but having it end in Alaska, you're really shortening up that line, and you're really putting assets closer to the fight, whatever port. And then, Scott, one more slide, just to Joy's point on the my slides. If you go down to the one with all the pictures right below the Ahoy slide, up two, right there. In the bottom middle picture, that's the Coast Guard cutter Alex Haley tied up in Nome, just to give everybody a visual of what we're talking about. That's the biggest cutter that's been able to pull in there. And it is tight and it's small in there. But what an asset to be able to pull any vessel, any kind of response. You're talking search and rescue, oil spill response, enforcement of laws, border security, to be able to pull in there and get the schlitz you need, again, to get logistics, is that forward operating base model that the church was talking about. You're closer up there. He had the surge forces up here. We're going to surge, forces are going to be surged here to address all these concerns, from food security for the locals to changing weather and responding to the disasters we've seen up there, to foreign adversaries. You need to be able to have logistics and ports to operate out of. And right now, it's minimally effective and doesn't match what others have.
Right. Let me, we've talked a lot about ADAC, but I just want to kind of emphasize this in hearings over the course of the last couple of years. We can go back to that slide that had the two routes. I've had the Indo-PACOM commander and the NORTHCOM commander saying how important that is to reopen that base. And again, to the General Ross's point, you know, during the 1990s, when we thought the, you know, peace dividend was here to stay and we weren't going to have any adversaries, I think that was a very strategic mistake to shut down that base. But many Alaskans know that, but that base was a naval air station, but it also had deep water access, one of the biggest fuel storage facilities in the world, 22 million gallons, two 8,000-mile runways, a giant hangar, and even subbase, which, as most people know, that's the one weapon system that the Chinese still fear dramatically, to have something that close. By the way, Chinese government has been watching the idea of reopening the ADAC Navy base, and they really dislike it. So that's, my view, a very good indication we're onto something. So my question is for, again, just the panel in general, particularly those of you who may have served out there or spent time there, restoring logistics, aviation capability, response times, domain awareness in the North Pacific, protecting our fisheries, which are under pressure from China and Russia. If you can provide just a little bit more insight, and then how would you, if you have any insights on how to go about moving this forward. We were able to get commitment. I was from the Secretary of War, Secretary Hegseth. I did have to put a hold on the confirmation of the Chief of Naval Operations because they weren't responding to me quickly enough. But they've now set up a very high-level task force within the Pentagon, way above the Navy. So it's Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force. The private sector is involved. The state of Alaska is involved. I actually think it's an exciting model to look at building out American infrastructure. It's actually the model in many ways that people don't know was used a lot during World War II. When we build out infrastructure across the world, it was kind of private sector led. not just the Navy Seabees or the Corps of Engineers. So any other thoughts on ADAC that we haven't covered? 115 million is not going to build it immediately, but it's a pretty darn good start. And they have a plan, and you know, you can use ADAC for testing, for intel, but our goal is to have that as a very important facility here soon, but to be innovative. And I think we're off to a pretty good start. Any thoughts on that?
Senator,
Ambassador?
some thoughts. I agree with every reason that we have all stated why ADAC is so important to the United States and our allies. ADAC, if you build ADAC, ADAC becomes, at least to me and many of the people I work with at the university, a key component of Golden Dome. It's an extension in our mind of Golden Dome. Here's how. There's a relationship between the Geophysical Institute, Poker Flat, HARP, our research capacity there, and Alaska Aerospace Corporation. There's an MOU signed between all of us to work together because the capacity we have together, Kodiak, Poker, is phenomenal. The capacity at HARP to be able to manipulate the ionosphere, it actually works, and now it's part of the university's portfolio of assets. We believe, researchers believe, that you can detect hypersonics earlier than we currently can now. If you create a hypersonic test range in the Aleutians by triangulating our current resources, we'll need more. There are a lot of other assets that would be needed. But if you were to build ADAC out, it becomes a key component in our mind of an Aleutian test range for hypersonics, detect them earlier. And that to me is our significant deterrence.
Great.
That's in discussion now with members of our.
ADAC is a key component to
Key
missile
component.
defense for America.
Correct.
I hadn't even.
If you put some assets out there that can correspond with the other assets that we have together with Alaska Aerospace, you can then build a hypersonic test range to test the research thesis that you can detect earlier. That's for Russia, that's China, and I would also add North Korea to that portfolio of adversaries we need to worry about.
Wow.
And that needs more work, but we talked about that with General George. Thank you for coming to the university and hosting General George. To have a member of the Joint Chiefs on campus was pretty good, and also General Clark as well.
Yeah.
Just the concept, it's public, but that puts ADAC in a very different place in addition to all the other things you've mentioned.
By the way, I think, I don't think I'm revealing anything, but next week, the ICEX is happening with, again, senior Navy officials, I think maybe including the Secretary of the Navy, going to be in Alaska doing the submarine ice exercises above us, which is also pretty exciting. Anyone else on ADAC?
Very quickly, sir. Also, on the 15th and 16th of March, I'll be up on ICEX as well. So
Great.
it'll be connecting with Navy sub labs. And this is all about the partnerships that Captain White mentioned earlier. Ambassador Reagan and I and our respective institutions are triangulating on the Geophysical Institute regarding this discussion he just mentioned about the hypersonics. The aspects about the instrumentation of the Aleutians is critical for this. But looking at the spot for sensing, for example, Cold Bay, Dutch, ADAC, Ericsson, and Atu are all locations that could help support with sensors of this aspect. The other aspect about this as well is if you take a look into the projecting power and defending our interests into the North Pacific, thinking about leveraging the partnership, the bilateral defense relationship we have with Japan is one other piece to this equation. We can counter what Beijing and Moscow are doing in the North Pacific by thinking jointly with Japan as an example to provide presence with presence, but thinking how it would also burden shift to have some more of the work into this North Pacific region shouldered in partnership with the Japanese.
Good. Other thoughts on ADAC? Let me ask, I'm going to wrap up here and then we're going to do a couple things that are a little unconventional in this Senate hearing. But normally we'd have a few more senators, so we might take advantage of some of our brilliant attendees. Domain awareness. Captain White, you have a very important role in terms of what you're doing now, but can you talk a little bit about the lack of domain awareness and in the Arctic, in the North Pacific, and again, how infrastructure can help us build out that and maybe even describe what that means, domain awareness?
Yeah, maritime domain awareness is knowing what's going on out on the water when, you know, and it's so important when you talk about not just national security, but just governing our water. So you need to, in order to do domain awareness, you need to have the right capabilities out there. And Alaska lacks from the rest of the United States severely. Just knowing what's there. The Coast Guard has built, and the Army Corps in the lower 48 a system where they can track boats via satellite and via terrestrial AIS. And real quick, just for the record, terrestrial AIS is needed because it's got a higher refresh rate. It picks up national security things, like if a vessel is spoofing its position, it battles against that if there are dark targets. And it really helps create that full picture. So you need to have satellite and terrestrial to have a system.
Just to be clear, we talked about an icebreaker gap, which definitely exists. Do we have a domain awareness gap up here relative to the rest of the country?
We do, and we've closed it. This might be an example of what everybody's been talking about here, using resources together. The Coast Guard R&D Center and the Marine Exchange of Alaska did a 5-year study saying, how can we get a way of detecting vessels up here in Alaska and communicate with them? They determined that terrestrial AIS would help do that. It was cost millions to build that out for the Coast Guard. They worked through the public-private partnership, and I think there might be a slide on it, Scott, just on the system that's built out. The Coast Guard had nothing up here. We put up 134 AIS receivers for them to close that gap, and that's been incorporated in what's called the National AIS System to get maritime domain awareness. In addition, these can communicate with vessels to send information up. We started doing that with VHF comms. VHF comms, which are enjoyed by our mariners anywhere in the lower 48. You can pick up the radio and call out, and somebody's going to answer from the Coast Guard. Up here in Alaska, about 19% of the coast is covered. That means for our fishermen, for the people moving oil, for the people moving mining supplies, they don't have that. That's a massive gap. 33 stations Coast Guard has. We just in the last 2 years put up 25 more. And I'll point out that they're in Adak, Dutch Harbor, all the way up north. We just put some in Kotzebue, and at the Red Dog Mine. We were all prepped for the hurricane that was going to hit, that went, or the typhoon that went a little south. Unfortunately, there was no comms there. It was a severe gap. It hindered our response to get to the people who needed help in the YK Yukon Delta. We're putting up 3 of them this summer. But that is an example how public-private partnership helps national security, because it closed that maritime domain awareness gap while providing a service to our mariners in Alaska, which really deserve the same that mariners in the lower 48 have.
Good. Let me ask Ms. Baker, you've done a great job on the Port of Nome. We're talking all about national security, which is very important. But can you also talk a little bit about what the Port of Nome is going to do for economic development, for safety, for the environment, for other things that are a little bit more closer to home for the region that you've done such a good job of representing?
Yes, thank you, Senator. When we worked with the Army Corps to develop the feasibility study, one of the major components, as the project was authorized under the Remote and Subsistence Harbors Bill, was the generation of extensive jobs with the port expansion to boost the regional economy that has, over the years, severely lacked with the good paying jobs to support these regional communities as well as Nome. The additional infrastructure will bring those jobs, those maritime jobs, as well as the corresponding jobs on the shore side and within the community, to address those gaps that have been building over the years across the Western Alaska, as well as the increased infrastructure, the expansion of the what we call the east side of the port to add, excuse me, docks for what we call our pedestrian traffic, will increase safety by separating that from the industrial and military traffic on the west side. And in addition to having the ability to stockpile and position oil spill response and search and rescue assets, excuse me, my throat isn't cooperating, in the region at this position so that they're not trying to pull oil spill responses and life safety mission resources from lower 48 or lower Alaska in responses to the events that are happening further north of us. The cruise industry has blown open. They're building more ice-strengthened hulls for tour ships. We're seeing more traffic, more, at this time, we're seeing larger vessels that need to anchor offshore because of their draft. They're bringing more and more people to the Arctic. The resources to respond to any type of an incident just must be positioned closer to where those incidents are going to occur. And Nome is prepared to, the infrastructure that will be developed will help enhance that positioning of those oil spill response assets and resupply and refueling the marine assets that are needed to transport that to the events.
Great. And then what about the mining that's going on in the Nome area as well?
Resource development, we have been working with Graphite One on the graphite mine for staging their export quantities out in our increased laydown area at the port. They have recently, as of last year, determined that the 40-foot basin is critical in their ability to export their resource for the vessels that they need to bring to Nome to take that resource out for processing.
Right.
So before they were discussing being able to use the backhaul capacity for the local cargo carriers, but that has since changed and that is not going to be sufficient to meet the demand. So in addition to, there are a number, I didn't bring a map, but there are a number of natural resource locations and potential sites across the Seward Peninsula that can benefit from the expanded capacity for export of all sorts of those critical minerals, in addition to graphite, to be exported with the expansion of the Port of Nome.
Great. Well, listen, you've been a great witness. We've a great panel of witnesses. We are a little bit into over a little bit over an hour and a half in this hearing. So I want to thank everybody because I'm chairing it and it's a field hearing. We're going to do two things that are a little bit unconventional, but I'm chairing it and we're in Alaska, and so we can do that. I'm going to take, we have a lot of experts in the audience. I see Mead and others. Maybe just take a few questions from our audience, and then we're going to turn to a press conference with the press that's here. If they have additional questions, and that's going to involve me, but also I think we check with the press to have the press conference open to our experts too, if they have any questions for you. So are there any, as we wrap it up, and again, I want to thank our excellent witnesses. I think it's just a great demonstration of, this would be an all-star panel. If we were back in DC in front of the whole Commerce Committee, this would be an all-star panel for the country. And the fact that it's all Alaskan citizens who all live here, who are all doing great work, it just shows you the depth, in my view, of the expertise that we have in our state And as I mentioned earlier, the people care, right? When the Pentagon was kind of going, hey, Alaska, sorry, you're not important anymore. We knew that was wrong. We knew it. Collective memory, knowing our history. And we all kind of fought back and said, no. We're not going to go into strategic irrelevance. You generals and admirals need to wake up and figure out, read a map, for goodness sakes, and see how important we are. And that's happening. And I know it. It's in large measure because of our very well-informed citizenry that made the case to our military leaders in DC, helping me and our delegation do that. So do we have any final thoughts? Mead, you got one just for the panel?
Yeah, just thank you, Senator. I really have two questions. One for starting with Ambassador Srega, but when we talk about the Chinese research in the Arctic Ocean, and both of us were chairs of the Arctic Research Commission. We look for cooperation and research internationally. But was the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement kind of a gold-plated invitation for the Chinese to come up and do a lot of fishing research in the Central Arctic? And is there anything we should do with that agreement to more moderate that, especially now that we own the ocean bottom in a large part of the Central Arctic that we have some sense to control? That's my first question. And then, Senator, for the whole panel, I just have read what you got in the Coast Guard authorization bill this year and in recent bills. You know, we have a new security effort in the Bering Sea to look at these, and that'll be a CMTS joint effort. Something we got in 4 years ago that you helped us get in, and Dr. Srega and I worked on this with you, was a Federal Advisory Committee on Shipping. And Church, you may have some things to report on that. I see your Assistant Scott there, and a group of us have worked on raising the standards for oil spill research. So all these things are going to contribute more to Arctic presence in the Bering Sea, and I'm just wondering if the panel had comments on that.
Good.
So those two things, China and the other thing.
As a former chairman of the Arctic Research Commission, he knows a heck of a lot about these issues.
He certainly does. We learn from him all the time. Meet on the issue of China and research. So, you know, to the senator's point, 4 or 5 research vessels off our coast this last summer. And if you nest the storyline of joint naval operations, joint Coast Guard operations, FSB, PRC, Coast Guard operations, it all sums up to, you know, they're not just here to innocently, I believe, research the area. I think there's a whole lot else going on. I think that's pretty clear.
Proven.
Yeah. With regard to their cooperation with the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement, I think that is, at the time when that was built, it was also in line with other international postures the U.S. and others had in terms of trying to bring China into the fold, whether it was the International Monetary Fund or the, you know, many multilateral organizations, with the hope that they would integrate into and be transparent about their work. That is still a hope. I would put a big question mark on that because of the activities that we see off our coast. So they seem to be engaged. The research enterprises seem to be engaged. But one thing we should never forget is there is no separation between civilian use and military use within the PRC. It is one thing, from the Antarctic to the Arctic to the oceans to all these spaces. And so, you know.
By the way, that's a great point, because I think sometimes we mirror image that and we think, oh, no, they don't do that. And if our commercial guys are out there, they're not military. So that must be the same with China. And it's a great point, because it is not the same with China.
I think I'll bring a point then.
But Mike, should we use our power of inspection now that we have this undersea, you know, to make sure they're not, I mean, they can't use the ocean bottom in their research without our permission now that we own that land, 2 Californias north of our EEZ. And I'm just wondering if there's some way to get more visibility on what the Chinese are doing.
Yeah, I think we have to. I believe we have to have a far more robust inspection review process. I think hearings like this help, because we're having trouble figuring out our own domain. and our own capacities. And so I worry about our capacity to do our work and then our capacity to monitor others to ensure that they too are doing things the way they should. So yeah, I think it needs to be robust across all, like in the Antarctic, where you can have quote unquote surprise investigations of stations in the Antarctic. It should be, I think, along those lines as well.
Any other,
I want to hop on this for a second because of two things that I offer. Number one, first of all, me, not only, of course, a distinguished former Lieutenant Governor and former Chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, but also serves as the Economic Energy Chair at the Stevens Center. I worked a little bit on the commission myself before coming to start in at the Stevens Center. And one piece of this is that during that time, I also served the Arctic Domain Awareness Center at the University of Alaska Anchorage. We didn't cover one important piece about domain awareness that I think is important for the record. The difference, distinguish between day-to-day where the traffic on the surface and the air are cooperative versus when they're not. How do we capture domain awareness for dark targets is a critical piece of the equation we did not address. Second piece is when the crisis happens, connectivity day-to-day that we rely on may not be available. Just a few days ago, I was with 11th Airborne up in JPMRC. I was at a military exercise, 11th Airborne on the interior, where it's an exercise. And these folks are using technology available today. A lot of the folks are maintaining battlefield awareness in this exercise, the Star Shield. That's fine when day-to-day. But when we're in a contested environment, how reliable are these technologies we become reliant on and day-to-day when the crisis goes on? I'm sure that connectivity is not going to be as reliant, or it may be susceptible to spoofing. So to Mead's point, though, when we look at the aspects of the shipping and increasing of economic opportunity through essentially the transpolar route, because if you look at the routes today between the Northwest Passage, right now, of course, it's pretty frozen over. It has a min draft of about 33 feet. The North Sea route's a draft of about 38 feet. You're looking at the transpolar routes, the only one that has an unlimited draft. You're seeing a lot of newer vessels are moving in at the 50 to 60-foot draft, putting essentially the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea route pretty much out of business. Transpolar is going to matter. Mead Treadwell put it together an effort a number of years ago called CLAC, looking at the aspects of authorizations to think about how you have a St. Lawrence Seaway of the transpolar route, not for today, but as it's coming as we're getting to a diminishing ice environment. We at the Stevens Center hosting a workshop on the 13th to 14th of April called an Arctic Pacific Security Dialogue, one of our regional security dialogues, workshops focused on addressing thorny problems. How do we look at Arctic shipping and the shortfalls and limitations that are coming when we're looking to try to take advantage and get ahead of the ball, or perhaps skate to where the puck is going to be in trying to figure this problem out? So looking forward, if folks are interested in that, come take a look with me later. We'll get you an invite.
right. Any other thoughts on that, Captain?
Yeah. We are looking at Arctic shipping right now. We got a live watch. There's a program called Arctic Watch created by Alaskans using technology. And I want to say something about all these ships operating. They are assets to our country. We're putting sensors on them. We just put a sensor on a camera on the Sikuliak because it operates up in the Arctic, so you can see everywhere it goes. It's down in the Antarctic right now. You can go on a web page and you can look and see everything that vessel is seeing as it operates. We're putting sensors on boats and working with local communities to gather information and bring it to a fusion center. And it's for industry, it's for managing that maritime transportation system, but it's totally beneficial to national security. So it addresses that whole spectrum of issues. And that's how we got to continue to work together. And that program, Arctic Watch, is also working with locals in the communities to gather information and have a fusion center. And it might be stuff that's relevant to Customs or the Coast Guard or DOD, or it might be stuff that's, hey, this is important for managing our ports and our maritime safety and logistics up there, but we need to work together if we're going to close this gap.
Good. Any other question, final from the audience?
On Save the Whales. I was up there at Save the Whales, and the ship that came in was, and sliced through that 15-foot wall of ice like butter, was a cargo ship, an ice-breaking cargo ship from the Soviet Union. That's how far behind.
Yeah. Well, we're making progress. Well, listen, I want to thank the panel again. I want to thank our audience. 2 hours, it's a long hearing, but I think it's very important. And now I'm looking at where's my team? Devin, where did you go? Okay, so I think now we're gonna just turn to, I think we have some press here. This was, the whole idea was to do a little bit of a press conference